Today we're going to be studying Paul's letters to the Thessalonians, and these are our first foray into a new genre of New Testament writings, and that's the basic letter. Now, today we're going to mostly study Paul's first letter, and you'll be reading his second letter on your own. But we're also going to start with some general principles that are going to apply to all of Paul's letters. So first, what is this genre of a letter? Now, on the screen, I have a picture of a letter from the 19th century. And one of the things that you can quickly see about a letter that you probably remember from learning to write, proper and informal salutations in elementary school is that letters tend to have a distinct cultural structure. And if you look at this one that's closer to our modern times, you can see that there is a date line, there is a greeting, there's a clear body, and there's a closing. And that we tend to note those structurally in what it looks like. And while email has become a very common form of letter writing today, email has a structure too, right? We've got a to line. Sometimes we have the CC, right? The anachronistic carbon copy line. There's a subject, and then it comes through automatically with the date. Today we have things called signature blocks, which are really common on emails. So letters tend to have a structure. So what's this structure like in the ancient world? In the ancient world, letter writers typically begin with an opening. And an opening has a very formal salutation, a greeting that is typically a little bit more descriptive than what we use today. Like today, we might just begin with dear, but they tended to have longer openings. After that formal salutation or greeting, it comes into a part called the Thanksgiving. And this is, exactly what it sounds like. It is the time where the letter writer would often give thanks for their relationship with the person who's receiving the letter. They might describe things that they've done in the past or share sentiments. And the length of the Thanksgiving really varies in the ancient world. And you'll see this in Paul's writings. Some of his Thanksgivings are shorter and some are longer. One of the things that Paul does, in addition to doing the traditional thanks to the one who's receiving the letter in the Thanksgiving, is that Paul often thanks God for what God is doing. And he also often foreshadows some of the themes that are going to come later on in his letter. So Thanksgivings can be a good hint as to what is to come. The next part of the letter is often the longest part, and this is the body or the main body of the letter. And this is where the sender kind of lays out their themes and topics, makes their argument if it's a kind of like a dialoguing rhetorical letter, or brings up the issues they were asked about if they're writing the letter to respond to something. And Paul, in the body of his letters, he's going to do different things depending on the situation. Sometimes he is going to share bits of his life story, a little bit of his autobiography. Sometimes he's going to give practical instructions on how to deal with a problem or a concern. Sometimes he's going to really try to persuade them, to give an exhortation, to make a pitch about how they should live or what they should be doing. But what you'll see across the board is Paul, like in his speeches in Acts of the Apostles, is always having an eye to who it is that's receiving this letter and what would be most relevant for them. And then comes at the end, not surprisingly, the closing of the letter. And in an ancient closing, again, thinking of a culture where letters are the primary means of communication between people living in different locations, right? No phones, no text messages, no social media. The closing is kind of going to be the place where they do a lot of what we do on social media today. They give like the shout out to all the different people that you want to be informed about this letter. You mentioned the helpers, people who might be transporting it or might have participated in the relationship. And partly this is because letters were commonly read aloud to groups of people. Remembering in the ancient world, a very small percentage of people are literate, say less than 10%. And so the reading aloud of a letter from different communities or different families to one another would be a way of getting kind of all those updates on life. So things that we might see in social media today, like in a Facebook group. That's a little bit what the end of some of Paul's letters are going to sound like. Now, quick caveat. Different interpreters, different readers of letters can have different opinions sometimes on what part is the thanksgiving versus the body, where exactly does the body end, and we start to get to closing, and that's totally fine. So, making an argument about why you think a particular verse is part of the thanksgiving and not the body, it can be a fun thing to do, but it's not something the church has, a doctrine or a dogma on. So certainly don't worry about it if you're reading a letter and you think the structure might be a little bit different than the editor of your Bible's footnotes might indicate. Now, the next aspect to consider with letters in the ancient world is the idea of authorship. And authorship has quite a number of diverse meanings in the ancient world. But I would argue that we have diverse meanings of authorship today, too, even in the modern world. So let's talk about the modern world first. When we think about authorship today, when we hear a speech from Pope Francis or even a famous secular political figure, is that person the author? In some ways, yes, because it's coming out of their mouth. But in other ways, no, because they commonly, as in the case for public figures, employ a speechwriter. Or in the case of a pope, sometimes they will be proclaiming something that comes from a particular congregation, like the Congregation for Doctrine and Faith. So they're proclaiming something that's actually the work of a committee. That's something we see in authorship in the modern world. Another thing we see is oftentimes we have memoirs or autobiographies written in the 21st century by a famous person, but they actually have another writer who has put it together in the sense that we give them co-authorship. It's that high of an involvement. So we have many diverse ways of understanding what it means to be the author of something today in our modern world. We can also think of authors today sometimes choosing to channel a previous author. So Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI, he has a wonderful book called The Spirit of the Liturgy. And in choosing that title, he is choosing the exact title of someone who had written about 70, 80 years beforehand and was long past, Father Romano Guardini. And in choosing that exact title, Pope Benedict is not plagiarizing, but he's deliberately taking up his thought and examining it in a new context. So all of these things today make up how we understand authorship. Now, in the ancient world, they had diverse understandings of authorship too. So I'm kind of going to talk about these across a spectrum. So if you think about it, on one hand, there is the physical writer. The act of writing itself was quite a skill in the ancient world. If you remember what those papyrus looked like, papyri, and we're going to see some Roman tablets in this lecture too, the physical act of forming letters and writing using those materials was a true skill. So many people who were highly literate, rhetorically brilliant speakers did not actually physically know how to use those tools of the ancient world to shape letters and to write out in script. So there's the person who physically writes is an author in a way. They're part of the process of writing. So because of this, secretaries were really, really common. So secretaries were well-educated people who would take the author's thinking and speeches and turn them into written form. So this happened in the ancient world and would be part of authorship. We can see this a little bit in Paul's writings. because sometimes in the closings, he will refer to, I am writing this in my own hand. And that's an indication that we've reached the rare point in his letters where he's not having that physical writer or secretary. Now, another concept is the idea of delegating writing to a coworker, someone who's on your team. And then the author approves it and kind of signs it after he gives the intent and topic. And this is something that, as I mentioned before, we very much do this today in the modern world, that there might be one person who is part of a team with a significant leader, and is doing the formulation into writing, even though we think of that work as written by the most famous person. Another style of authorship is the idea of posthumous compilation. So this is compiling somebody's writings after they have died. They're unpublished letters, we might think of, and then putting it together to be disseminated more widely. This happened a lot in the ancient world, and we actually even see it today. In spiritual writing, I can think of I've read books that are by Father Henry Nouwen, right? They're by him. His name's on the cover. I think of them as being his writings, but they were actually put together after his death by some of his students. So they would be those posthumous people who are compiling little bits of things other people had, someone had written, and putting them together. And when we think of all of these different meanings and facets of authorship, what's important to remember is these are all real. All the things I've described, we wouldn't think of any of these as fraudulent or forgery or dishonest. It's simply the reality that authorship is something that can be complex and diverse. So, to Paul's letters, there are many different hypotheses on which of his letters might fall more into one of these categories than the other. And like with authorship of the Gospels, this isn't something that the church has a doctrinal teaching on. It's not something that we consider part of public revelation, that God has told us exactly what style of authorship a particular letter of Paul's might be in. But for some of them, we have some really good hypotheses, some really good guesses. But there's this wonderful summary from one of the church's most influential Pauline scholars, Father Murphy O'Connor. And he says, whatever hypotheses you're interested in for authorship, know that there's very little scholarly doubt that a single mind, Paul, is behind the letters that we call by his name, even though there's clearly a team involved and different secretaries and stuff like that. But it is all so unified. It is without a doubt, with little doubt, he says, coming from this single person and his single missionary efforts across his lifetime. And to imagine this a little bit more, I like this picture. Someone had sketched this out for a course on Paul's letters done from a secular perspective at Harvard Divinity School. And what it shows is it's a great way of imagining Paul and his team writing. So that's what's depicted in the large picture, Paul writing and his team. And that these are going to be sent out and passed along to different communities, different groups of people. And this cooperation kind of shows us that we should expect development and changes in style over time, because that's what happens when human beings connect and communicate. When we as humans are interacting with each other, we're never stagnant, because not only is the Holy Spirit shaping us, but God is working on us through other people. And so that also, this reality, makes it difficult sometimes to exactly understand authorship, because you can see changes over time, and there's really no way to tell, is this a change in a particular secretary or coworker, or is it that natural development of one's mind and heart throughout human life and through those relationships. So imagining the network, I think, gives us the best vantage point into really understanding authorship.